Famed Scottish theologian Thomas Chalmers. Oh yeah, aliens totally exist. And then here's a quote from Chalmers to start us off here. World's role in these distant regions, and these worlds must be the mansions of life and of intelligence. So I was recently at the conference of the Association of Classical Christian Schools in Atlanta, and when there I heard a talk by George Grant on what are called the astronomical discourses of Thomas Chalmers. So if you don't know, Chalmers was a Presbyterian Scottish minister born in 1780, and so I think early 1800s here. And by Grant's telling anyway, he basically revived by himself true religion in Scotland. His discourses began as a series of public lectures, and you can now purchase them as a book if you just search for the title, or you can also find the full text online. George Grant's talk at ACCS was really about the importance of doing anticipatory scientific apologetics. So in other words, sort of answering the questions science is raising about the Christian faith before most people have a chance to be bothered by them. So in Chalmers' day, there was a growing idea that astronomy disproved Christianity, and so Chalmers was trying to jump out in front of that with his speeches. George Grant mentioned that Chalmers' astronomical discourses were briefly the best-selling book in the English language, and here I had never heard about them. So I wanted to learn more about the arguments Chalmers made. Grant didn't really provide that in his speech, unfortunately, but I did think, I got to read that, and so I've been reading. I've read the first speech so far, and it's great. I wish I had known about it when I was teaching astronomy last year. It would have been a great read with sufficiently advanced Christian astronomy students. It is written by a very smart man in the early 1800s, so the language is a little high as far as that goes. What is he rebutting? So Chalmers says that the infidels, and he does call them that, are arguing that astronomy disproves the Christian faith, and they're basically making 2 points. So one, they say Christianity is a religion which professes to be designed for the single benefit of our world. And, although he's going to elaborate on this, Chalmers briefly says Christianity makes no such profession. And two, God cannot be the author of Christianity because God would not lavish so much particular attention on this one world. And again, he's going to elaborate, but to that briefly, Chalmers says, we can lay no limit on the condescension of God or the multiplicity of his regards. So we may have multiple videos on the discourses, but here I wanted to draw out the first speech for you. So the first speech is called A Sketch of the Modern Astronomy. And by my reading, a big point of his first speech was just to say to his audience, look, guys, before I get deep into the theology, I want to let you know I do understand the science as well. Let me tell you about it, and let me, in fact, marvel a little bit in God's creation. So I was impressed, and as our title suggests there, he makes some surprising points along the way. So Chalmers begins by saying that part of his goal is to soften and subdue those prejudices which lie at the bottom of what may be called the infidelity of natural science, if possible, to bring over to the humility of the gospel those who expiate with delight on the wonders and the sublimities of creation. So you see 2 things right off the bat here. One, and you feel this again and again, but Chalmers loves the science. After all, the science helps show us the wonders and sublimities of creation. And another place in the discourse he refers to, quote, the science of these enlightened times. And although you could say something like that sarcastically, I think he means it. We live in enlightened times with good science. In our day today, I know we sometimes have to contend with, quote, the science, which often actually has little to do with science itself. So I understand, because of that, many Christians get kind of spooked by science. But as I often say, we don't have to be. True science is on our side. And then two, and you see this, you feel this again and again from Chalmers also, that there's a sort of an arrogance problem with some of these natural scientists and philosophers. They think they know a whole lot more than they do. Thank goodness that's no longer a problem in 2024. So we need to bring them over to the humility of the gospel. And then he goes on to say, it's perfectly appropriate to extract lessons from science or from the natural world, because even Scripture does that, right? Behold the lilies of the field is an argument for confidence in God from the appearance of a flower. And then Chalmers goes on to say, it is truly a most Christian exercise to extract a sentiment of piety from the works and appearances of nature. He then gets into astronomy proper, and with a focus on our solar system in particular. So for all of human history, we've seen these lights in the sky. But what are they? What can these lights be? So it's in our nature to wonder about such things, and he says, it has been reserved for these latter times to resolve this great and interesting question. So what do we know? And it's kind of impressive to hear a minister explain this, but what do we know? So the stars, he says, are large and remarkably far away, appearing as points to us only because of their great distance. The moon has the magnitude of a world of itself. The sun is really a globe, thousands of times the size of the earth, and our earth is a round ball, occupying its own, actually very small, place in the firmament. And then, and the stuff I found most fascinating actually, he spends quite a while saying Would God have made these vast heavens and us be the only intelligent creatures around to admire them? Seems unlikely. He says, but when we explore the unlimited tracts of that space, which is everywhere around us, we meet with other balls of equal or superior magnitude, and from which our Earth would either be invisible or appear as small as any of those twinkling stars which are seen in the canopy of the heaven. Why then suppose that this little spot, little at least in the immensity that surrounds it, should be the exclusive abode of life and of intelligence? He says, would the great architect of nature really call these stately mansions into existence and leave them unoccupied? Is it reasonable to say that to this earth alone belongs the bloom of vegetation, or the blessedness of life, or the dignity of rational and immortal existence? And then he then focuses a little bit on the planets in our solar system, and I think some moderns would disagree here, but he argues that it's reasonable to think that life exists even on those other planets in our solar system. And again, imagine you're a guy in the early 1800s here. He says, after all, those other planets behave similarly to Earth. They have their own rotation. They perform a yearly revolution of the sun. They have seasons. The comments in Genesis 1 about the purposes of the sun and the moon, or the moons perhaps in their case, and the stars would seem to apply to other planets in our solar system as well. Chalmers says, to each of them, the heavens present as varied and magnificent a spectacle, and this earth, the encompassing of which would require the labor of years from one of its puny inhabitants, is but one of the lesser lights which sparkle in their firmament. And he goes on to say these planets have other similarities with Earth as well. Again, imagine you're a guy in the early 1800s. One of these planets has mountains and valleys. Another has an atmosphere, which may support the respiration of animals. A third has clouds, which may minister to vegetation. One has polar ice caps that grow and shrink, suggesting snow. Who knows, he says, but the future telescopes will spot clear signs of cultivation, or great cities. The thought of space travel itself, actually visiting these places, seems to be not in his thinking. He's just thinking we're going to build bigger and bigger telescopes with better resolution, and eventually maybe we'll be able to spot the cities on these other planets directly. Then he's going to say, just because we cannot see any other life, should we really conceive that silence and solitude reign throughout the mighty empire of nature, and that the greater part of creation is an empty parade, and that not a worshipper of the divinity is to be found through the wide extent of you vast and immeasurable regions? He says, we're so small, it does indeed justify the exclamation of the psalmist that what is man, that thou art mindful of him. Indeed, our own planet is small, among the least of those in our solar system, he says. If our own Earth were to sink into annihilation, this event would go entirely unnoticed on the other worlds in our solar system. So cheers to that. He says, we should learn to look We should learn not to look on our Earth as the universe of God, but one paltry and insignificant portion of it, that it is only one of the many mansions which the Supreme Being has created for the accommodation of his worshippers, and only one of the many worlds rolling in that flood of light which the sun pours around him to the outer limits of the planetary system. He then goes on to talk about, so we've done our own solar system, what purpose have our other stars? Do those other stars really exist just to provide the tiny bit of light that reaches the planet Earth? Or, he says, quote, do they serve a purpose worthier of themselves? The other stars, he says, are very far away. A cannonball fired off from Earth would take hundreds of thousands of years to reach the nearest star. No human mind can really comprehend that immensity. And then he says, we see the distant stars not because they reflect light, like the moon, but because they are luminous in themselves. In short, they are, quote, so many suns, each thrown in the center of his own dominion. And then interestingly, he goes on to note that some of these distant stars show a periodic variation in their light intensity. He suggests, and this is not right, but he suggests that, our own sun has sunspots. If all those sunspots were grouped on one side, then as our sun rotated, it would show a periodic variation in light intensity, and he suggests that maybe this is what's happening to those other stars. And let me remind you here that the first exoplanet wasn't actually discovered until 1995. He suggests that other stars have their own planets too. So he says, why may not each of them be the center of his own system and give light to his own worlds? And then he offers the quotation we started off this little chat with. Worlds roll in these distant regions, and these worlds must be the mansions of life and of intelligence, which is a very aggressive claim to make. There we go. And then, sort of as a side comment here, but he notes that all the planets in our solar system have a dual motion. They rotate, and they revolve around the sun. And he suggests that such dual motion to a planet could be imparted by an off-center impact with another body, and that's true. But I found the whole discussion interesting because this means he's open to the idea that God did not just make our planets as we observe them now, with the rotation and revolution they have now, but rather that perhaps these things developed later by natural processes. So here's a famous minister in the early 1800s, happy to entertain that suggestion. He does also say, it could just be divine fiat. It's possible that God just made the solar system, as it looks right now. He just made it that way. That's possible. But he's willing to entertain the idea that that these changes developed later because of natural processes. So I found that interesting. Toward the end, he alludes to the then recent discovery of the nebulae, and he says, perhaps the stars also are arranged into groups, which is just fascinating to read this discussion. He notes that the mansion that accommodates our species might be so very small as to lie wrapped in microscopical concealment, and therefore, is it presumption to say that the moral world extends to these distant and unknown regions, that they are occupied with people, that the charities of home and of neighborhood flourish there, that the praises of God are there lifted up, and his goodness rejoiced in? After all, the universe at large would suffer as little in its splendor and variety by the destruction of our planet as the verdure and sublime magnitude of a forest would suffer by the fall of a dull leaf. So cheers again to that. And then he goes on to say, to sort of describe all the ways our planet could be destroyed. After all, the fire that rages within, he says, our planet might lift to the surface and turn the whole Earth into one wide and wasting volcano. We need more sermons with that illustration. Or a comet could hit us and either launch us into the sun or off into deep space. But, he sort of finishes up, after these terrifying scenarios, there is hope. We may therefore be grateful that the God who sitteth above and presides in high authority over all worlds is mindful of man, and that I am as much known to him as if I were the single object of all his attention. But, after all of that, you might think, but wait a minute. And he says, is it likely, says the infidel, that God would send his eternal Son to die for the puny occupiers of so insignificant a present in the mighty field of his creation? You might love for me to answer that, but that is the second discourse. So you're going to have to either read that by yourself for now or wait for video number 2.